The internet age, and it was going to be noticed. And I'd be second guessed for years, maybe decades. I had that knowledge, but I did not let that knowledge dissuade me from making the tough choices I had to make and sticking with them. On January 15, 2009, I had been flying airplanes for 42 years. I had 20,000 hours in the air. And all during that time, and this is how reliable not only our systems, our technology, and our machines have become, and not an indication only of how good our human performance has become. In all that time, in 4 decades, I had never been so challenged in an airplane I ever doubted the outcome. But this, I knew instantly was very different. I knew this was going to be the worst day of my life. We had just taken off from New York LaGuardia Airport, climbing through 2,880 feet. And I saw birds, probably 3.5, we know from the digital flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, I saw them about 3.5 seconds before we struck them. But clearly not enough time to maneuver a large, heavy, fast jet airliner away from them. And then they filled the windscreen as if it were a Hitchcock film. I know by making that reference I'm dating myself, but you know what I mean. And then I could hear and feel the thumps and thuds as we struck them across the leading edge of both wings, the nose of the airplane just below the level of cockpit windows, and into the center, the core of both jet engines. As you probably know, jet engines are turbines, finely balanced machinery spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute to provide thrust. And having these massive birds go through them is incredibly damaging. The NTSB engaged an ornithology expert from the Smithsonian to determine from the bird residue what kinds of birds they were and how big they were. And interestingly, the PhD they picked was named Dr. Carla Dove. Who knew? It turned out that these were the species Canada geese. Now, we don't know that they were from Canada. We just know that they're Canada geese. That's the species. And they weigh 10, 12, 14, 16 pounds with 5 foot or 6 foot wingspans. So it's no surprise that they completely trashed our engines. In the FAA certifications of engines, they use a much smaller bird shot by an air gun into a running engine to prove that it could still provide some thrust. But our engines could not. It was such a sudden shock when I heard the birds hit us. And when the birds entered both engines, I heard a loud boom. And then I remember vividly my first 3 thoughts. First, this can't be happening. Having read about other accident flights, a very common thought rooted in disbelief, followed immediately by, this doesn't happen to me. In other words, for 4 decades, I had never experienced anything I didn't think I could handle. And my third thought was the realization that unlike all those other flights for 4 decades, this flight probably would not end on a runway with the aircraft undamaged. And I was okay with that, as long as I could solve the problem. Immediately, I heard terrible noises coming from the engines as they were being destroyed. I could feel terrible vibrations I'd never felt in an airplane before as the engines were being trashed. And then I received confirmation of what I believed happened when I could smell coming into the cabin air supply the burning bird odor from the engines. And then the thrust loss. The thrust loss. I used as a chapter title in my first book, Highest Duty, re-released when the film came out, as Sully. The words that I used to describe the thrust loss to the investigators in our first interview with them 2 days after the flight. It was sudden, complete, symmetrical bilaterally. It felt as if the forward motion of the airplane nearly stopped in midair. It felt as if the bottom was falling out of our world. And my body responded in a very normal, natural, human, physiological stress response to this intense event. I was aware of that as it happened. I could feel my blood pressure shoot up, my pulse spike. I sensed my perceptual field narrow in tunnel vision because of the stress. I did three things that made the difference. First, I forced a kind of calm on myself, but we weren't really able to be calm. The stress was too intense. I think what it really was we had, Jeff and I, the mental discipline based upon all these years of flying to compartmentalize our minds and focus clearly on the tasks at hand in spite of how distracting and debilitating that the stress level was. It absolutely interfered with our ability to perform. But we normally performed at such an extraordinarily high level that even degraded, we were up to the task. And within 2.5 seconds, I began to take by memory the first two remedial actions that we would eventually get to on our dual engine blame out checklist. A minute later, a third of the way through the remaining flight time before we landed. But I needed these actions to be effective yesterday, not a minute from now. So I reached down to the console, turned on the engine ignition so if the engines could recover, they would. And I reached up to the overhead panel and started the engine, the airplane's auxiliary power unit, the APU, to provide a backup source of electrical power. I knew it was a matter of maybe less than a minute before the engine RPM decayed enough on both engines, having been damaged, that the generators would no longer function to provide electrical power to all our 231 computers in our Airbus A320. Of course, without them, we can use battery power, but that results in a much more rudimentary manner of flight. So by starting the APU as soon as I did, by the time the engine RPM decayed and the electrical power source from the engine stopped, the APU was up online. That was one of the best choices I made at that moment. I began a left turn, took control from our first officer, Jeff Strauss, not because of any reason I didn't trust him, but because he was brand new on the Airbus. He'd been a captain on the 737, but this was his first flight with a revenue pilot like me and not a check airman, an instructor that he'd just done before, the week before. So I had the greater time and type. I had more experience in this airplane. I knew it inside out, and it gave me the huge advantage to be able to handle this. And besides as captain, I felt like it was my responsibility to fly. I made a left turn. I knew from experience there were only three options. There were only two runways near us, LaGuardia, from which it departed, but at this point we're heading directly away from it, descending rapidly. I pushed the nose over to glide to provide air over the wings to maintain lift, but by doing so we were descending, using gravity for the forward motion of the airplane. And we were descending at a rate equivalent to being in a hotel elevator 2 floors per second. So I knew it was just a matter of mere minutes before we reached the surface. I knew we couldn't get as far as LaGuardia or Teterboro Airport in New Jersey across the river. And I knew if I made a choice to one of these airports and then realized I couldn't glide that far, we would land short, probably injure or kill many on the airplane and perhaps people on the ground. So before I chose one of the three options, one of the two airports or some place else, I had to be absolutely certain I could glide as far as one of those choices. So I quickly ruled out the airports. And then it was obvious to me that the only other place in the area that was long enough, wide enough, smooth enough, free of obstacles enough even to attempt landing a large, heavy, fast jet airliner was the Hudson River. But we had never trained to land anywhere other than a runway. But I was confident I could find a way to do it. I knew I had to make one announcement in the cabin before we landed. Some of the passengers, I'm sure, could see that we were descending over water and we were not going to be making it back to runway. And before I spoke, I wanted to First of all, sound confident. I wanted to identify myself as the captain, as the decision maker. And because I knew that courage can be contagious, and I absolutely needed it to be. I wanted passengers and crew in the cabin to hear me when I spoke in the PA, hear my voice, that I've got this, that I have a plan that will work. And we were trained in an emergency landing to use a particular word that's one of the many single words in aviation that's rich with meaning. And that word is brace. When the pilots use that word in an announcement, it's a signal to the cabin crew, the flight attendants, that an emergency landing is imminent and that they should help the passengers avoid injury during the landing so they'll be able to evacuate. And then in the spur of the moment, I chose another word that we were then not trained to use, but I believe they are now, to give passengers and the crew in the cabin alike a vivid image, a word picture of what to expect. That without engine thrust, this was going to be a hard landing. I just didn't know how hard. Jeff and I had never done this before. So I came up with what I think in retrospect was the perfect word: impact. I said, this is the captain, brace for impact. And almost immediately through that armored cockpit door, I could hear the two flight attendants in the front jump seat, Donna and Sheila, and I'm sure Doreen in the back of the airplane was doing the same, begin shouting their commands in unison over and over again to the passengers. This is what they said. This is what I heard. Brace, brace, brace. Heads down, stay down. Brace, brace, brace. Heads down, stay down. I think now, imagine being in that cabin and hearing that for 90 seconds before you make this landing on a river. But they did, and people began to try to cushion themselves. I've met almost all the passengers, and many of them, and I've heard many of their stories, and they are so amazingly touching. One young man, Eric, someone we've become close with, just by chance, an American living in Paris. He was back in the States to see his mother and sister. And he had been in a close call on an airplane decades before, taking off out of LAX, Los Angeles International, over the Pacific Ocean. They were in an airplane, and due to a design choice that the manufacturer of that airplane had made, the fuel control shut-off switches and the engine computer control switches were very close to one another. And taking off from LAX, the engines were not behaving quite right, and their procedure was to turn off and then back on both engine computer control systems. Well, in their haste, they mistakenly turned off the fuel selectors, and the engines immediately began to spool back. They made the same noise that our engines made, which is the most sickening pit of your stomach going through the floor kind of a sound. Ooh, as they spun down. They quickly recovered and got back farther off the ocean. And amazingly, that crew chose to continue on to their destination in Cincinnati instead of making an emergency landing in Los Angeles. And the cabin had been chaos. People had tried to life vests on. I'm sure they'd served free drinks on that flight. So anyway, he did on our flight the same thing he'd done on that previous one back in the 80s. He took out one of his business cards. He wrote to his mother and his sister, "I love you," and he jammed it as far in his pocket as he could, hoping it would not be separated from his body. Another passenger, Michelle, that I've talked to a number of times, was in a window seat. She could see where we were headed. She took her cell phone out of her purse and wanted to call her mother, but then she thought better of it. She told me later she didn't want her mother to hear her die, and so she put her phone away. As we got closer to the river, Jeff Skiles knew that we both had to make important decisions about what flaps to use, how high above the water to begin the landing because we were descending so rapidly. But we didn't have time to talk about it. As I was taking these actions and making these decisions, Jeff told me he was watching me and silently cheering me on, helping what he could. But he told me also later that he was fully able and prepared to be a good first officer, and if I was going to do something that was not going to lead to the best outcome, he was going to directly tell me that. But he was happy with what was going on so far. And as we got closer to the water, I asked him a question. You can see it in the cockpit voice recorder transcript. I said, "Got any ideas?" You see, some think that was a flippant remark. People who know me well are not sure I'm capable of making a flippant remark. I'm a pretty serious guy. But Jeff Skiles understood absolutely in that context what I was asking him, which was this. I've done everything I could think of that will help us be more successful. Is there anything else you can think of? Are there any other actions we can take that would help us be more successful, even by a fraction? And he answered, actually not. You see, some think he was being flippant, but he wasn't. He wasn't being insouciant, and he wasn't resigned to some ineluctable fate. Far from it. We were trying to save every life to the very end of this episode. I think he answered that way at that point because he knew we had done all we could. We did all we could. I think that was our solace then. It remains our solace now. We did all we could. And then Jeff also knew that the final critical maneuver was for me, looking at this featureless water terrain, this river ahead of us, to judge that using depth perception that's inherently difficult over water, to judge the height at which to start raising the nose to begin the landing. And we were descending so rapidly, it was going to have to be done within a fraction of a second. If I started to raise the nose too soon at too high a height, we would get too slow, lose lift, and drop it in hitting hard, probably breaking the airplane. If I waited too long, even a half second too late, we would touch without having a chance to get the nose up, hit nose first. One of the underslung engines would probably be ripped off and turn the airplane around, perhaps breaking it. So it was critical that we begin at just the right height, not too high, not too low. Knowing this, Jeff, again on his own initiative, knew how to do this to help me. Someone with a lot less experience wouldn't have known either to do that or how to do that. And he began to call out to me at a cadence altitude as we descended, so I could remain looking outside and watching the earth come up toward us and trying to judge the proper height to begin the landing without having to look inside at the altimeter and the airspeed indicator. So he did that for me, calling off airspeed and altitude and in a cadence. And then we know from the digital flight data recorder that I began to pull the nose up at 100 feet, and we were descending so rapidly, it took only 4 seconds to get from 100 feet to touchdown in the river. And I knew I needed to get the nose up to about 10 degrees. We know from the digital flight data recorder, I was able to pull the nose up, and when we touched the water, we got to 9.8 degrees. Had we had time to get all the way through what Airbus and the airline had given us was a 3-page checklist meant to be used from 35,000 feet when you have 30 minutes to get through it, we would have known we should be shooting for 11 degrees nose up. They've since redone the checklist, but like all organizations, it took the airline, the Airbus, the manufacturer, and the FAA, and the European Aviation Safety Association, 9 years to update the checklist. So now there's a much shorter one meant to be used at low altitude. So that's one thing that's changed. The touchdown was hard, but the deceleration as we slowed in the river was uniform. So based upon the forces that we felt in the cockpit, and once we stopped in the river, it was obvious the airplane was intact, it was stable, it was floating. And in the most amazing coincidence, Jeff and I in the cockpit turned to each other at the same time in the same words said, "Well, that wasn't as bad as I thought." We thought it was going to be really bad. But we weren't high-fiving, but it was an acknowledgement that we'd solved the first and the biggest problem of the day. But now we had to get 155 people, passengers and crew, out of an airplane, taking on water from back to front because we hit the water with the tail first, in a river in January, where the air temperature was 21 degrees Fahrenheit, the water was 36, and people were going to be getting wet as they evacuated, and hypothermia can kill. Fortunately, I chose to land right between the ferry terminals in New York, New Jersey, in the middle of the Hudson, the only place in the entire area where rescue could happen fast enough on such a cold day. They saw us heading at low altitude over the river and knowing that wasn't normal, and radioed their ferries that were already on the river to head toward us without awaiting any official warning or request. The evacuation was obviously chaotic, happening with no notice and no chance to prepare. We know from watching the security cameras along the river, it took 3.5 minutes to get everyone out, much longer than the FAA's 90-second certification assumptions. When it was obvious that people were out, and we had one elderly woman, 90 years old, who had been boarded in a wheelchair, got helped out by passengers and crew. We had the youngest passenger on the flight, a 9-month-old boy, Damien, who was in his mother's lap. An Army officer, former Army officer sitting next to her, volunteered to hold him more security than she could. She agreed, and he was kept safe. So we had a lot of people who needed to be helped out. But it was chaotic, but there was a lot of cooperative behavior too. People helping each other, as well as climbing over the seats, trying to get out as fast as they could. When it was obvious that everybody seemed to be out, there was no way I was going to let somebody else die for any other reason if I could possibly help it after pulling this off. So I determined that I was so intensely energized and stressed by this whole event that I didn't completely trust my senses not to miss someone. So instead of just going through the cabin once, I decided to go through the cabin twice, looking down each row to make sure that everyone was out and there was no possibility of anyone being left behind. Our A flight attendant, who was up at the front left door, 1L, got impatient with me as I went to the back the second time. And she yelled at me from the front, "We need to get off this airplane right now." I said, "I'm coming." And after I was doubly sure that there was no one left, the last three of us to leave in order were our A flight attendant, Donna Dent, our first officer, Jeff Skiles, and then me. That sounds like, we weren't trained to do that. It was just obvious that's what should happen. It sounds like something they would have done on the Titanic had they been able to, but it's following a protocol, but it was just what we should do. I got into the raft. By the time I left the airplane, well, the first ferry got there less than 4 minutes. By the time I left the airplane, as the last one off, the ferries were all around us and the rescue had already begun. I yelled to the ferries to pick off the people on the wings first and not in the slide rafts, because people on the wings were in a more precarious position and should be rescued first, and they did that. I was still trying to get a head count, but of course it was impossible under those conditions. First of all, I was on one side of the airplane. The fuselage prevented me from seeing the other side of the airplane. So I was just deathly afraid that someone was going to fall and float away and drown and not be noticed. So once we were pulled into the ferry, pulled up to the ferry, I had a flip phone. It was on my belt. I'd gotten wet right to here, so my phone still functioned. And my first call was not to my wife, Lori, at home. It was to the airline operations center to tell them what had happened and how many people we had to account for, 155. And then I did call Lori next. And at the time, she was doing outdoor fitness segments for ABC7. And she was on the phone with her producer on a business call. And we had 2 landlines and she had a cell. And so I I really wanted to talk to her. I wanted her to find out from me and not some other way what had happened. So I kept ping-ponging back from phone to phone, and I saw that one was busy, so she was on the phone, and I was telling her essentially, I want to talk to you. And she finally said to her colleague, Sully's being a pest, I better see what he wants. Now, give her some slack. I know every spouse has done this. And she answered by saying, what? And she was expecting me to be home that night. I was have to commute home from Charlotte to San Francisco where we lived. And she said, I said, I just wanted to let you know I'm okay. And she said, okay, I'll see you tonight then. So she thought I had made it on my commute flight home, and I was going to see her that night. And I said, no, there's been an incident. And so then she thinks, okay, well, one of the cargo tugs hit the airplane, and now there's a delay or something, you know. So I said, okay. I said, there's been an incident. She said, okay, I'll see you tomorrow then. And I said, are you watching TV? And she said, no. I said, turn the TV on. I said, we hit a flock of birds. I lost both engines. I had to land the airplane in the Hudson River, but we got everybody off. But I have to account for them. I have other duties to respond. I'll call you. I have other duties to perform. I'll call you later. And then she just was in shock and didn't know what to do and just collapsed on the bed. And then finally called her friend Kathy, who said, go get the girls from school and don't let them watch TV. And our daughters are now 31 and 29. One's a doctor, one's a PhD in education. And at the time they were in the eighth grade and sixth grade. And so she went to get the younger one first at middle school. And of course, any kid knows that when your mom comes to get you early from school, it's not something good. And of course, they knew I'm an airline pilot. And we just had the 23rd anniversary of one of the worst happenstances in aviation history. And that was on our minds. It had only been 8 years at that time. And so when Lori went to get our younger daughter from school, she came out just inconsolable, tears just cascading down. And Lori said, he's okay. I talked to him, he's okay. But she just couldn't be consoled. We didn't learn until later exactly why she reacted the way she did. See, it turned out that she was so young in 2001, that every time I went to work after that, she had essentially been holding her breath. And on that day, it all came out. And she's fine now. But yeah, it was really something. In the days and weeks after this landing, I began to hear from airline colleagues of mine, people I've flown with years, sometimes decades before. And they started to tell me what they had begun to call Sully stories of long ago events that I had forgotten, but that they had not. And once I was told about some safety issue and how we resolved it, but most of the time I was simply told about something more prosaic.